10 years ago, a decision was taken in Paris to give the go-ahead for an enormous project that would cost millions upon millions of francs and send French prestige soaring round the world. No, it wasn't anything to do with the supersonic Concorde. It was something much closer to the nation's heart, French culture. The plan was for a mammoth arts center in Paris, and the man who took the decision was President Georges Pompidou. He died, but his dream did not. And this month, the Georges Pompidou Center for Art and Culture is celebrating its 2nd anniversary. Pompidou never saw the building, but he did see the plans. There'll be some shouting over this, he predicted, and he was right. For most people, to see it was to hate it. They called it an oil refinery, a monstrosity that clashed outrageously with the 18th and 19th century buildings among which it was set. In fact, the architects had very carefully matched the proportions to the surroundings. But that's where any similarity ends, for the Pompidou Center is aggressively, unreservedly modern, revolutionary even. For this is a building turned inside out. All the service pipes and tubes, normally hidden, are boldly displayed in color on the outside. One critic sourly compared it to a creature cut in two, with its intestines falling out. The air conditioning vents have been given a nautical look, and critics have made the most of the opportunity to see the building as some vast steamship aground in the center of Paris. Creating a space for the center meant knocking a very big hole in what had been a densely packed area of Paris. Much of it was already run down, but the demolition was bitterly opposed by local people and other groups who would have preferred to see it restored. This is the area that contained Les Halles, the famous old market which was in its heyday an important part of Parisian popular culture. It was a natural meeting place, and few habitués believed it could be replaced by any self-conscious art center. In short, there was an overwhelming feeling that this was the wrong thing in the wrong place, a prestige project that would bring little advantage to people living and working in the area. It became a political issue. The main opposition party, the Socialists, saw it as a failure to tackle the real problems, and typical of the way the government spent vast sums to satisfy a small elite.
Cette politique acceptée par la ville sert essentiellement une élite et une clientèle internationale seule capable d'accéder intellectuellement, financièrement, culturellement aux manifestations prévues dans ce cadre.
There were many other groups who echoed the same sentiments. They claimed that France's Ministry of Culture had already loaded the dice far too heavily in favor of Paris. The opera, the Comédie Française, the National Popular Theatre, all of France's cultural jewels are in the capital, but the enormous sums they cost to run come out of the national budget for the arts. As a result, it's claimed, the provinces are starved of funds. On this argument, what was needed was not one Pompidou Center, but a dozen smaller projects spread across the nation. The protests were in vain, and on January the 31st, 1977, the center was officially inaugurated at a glittering ceremony attended by an international list of guests. Pompidou's successor, President Giscard d'Estaing, had steered the project to completion, declaring that culture was among the nation's top priorities. Among the guests of honor, Madame Pompidou, the president's widow. Opera, theater, and music of all kinds had been an important part of their busy social life together. The building, now usually called the Beaubourg Centre, after the square it's built on, cost 900 million francs. Critics claim there simply wasn't the interest locally to support such an expenditure. But the crowds have arrived, day after day, ever since the opening. Beaubourg was built to take about 4,500 people at any one time. The organisers hoped to get a total of about 10,000 visitors a day. That figure was soon doubled, and by the end of the first year, some 6 million people had passed through the turnstiles and up the plexiglass escalators. Throughout the second year of operation, daily attendance rose from 20 to 25,000, bringing the yearly total up to a staggering 7.5 million visitors. That's well over double the total for the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower put together. Up on the 5th floor, there's a fine view across Paris, to the far more traditional landmarks of Montmartre. Turning the building inside out has meant that the available space can be used in a far more adventurous way than normal. Some galleries are completely open, not so much a museum as a system of decorated walkways, equally appealing to the serious art student and to those who simply want to look and saunter on. In a building that owes such an obvious debt to modern technology, it's no surprise to find exhibits that reflect on the origins of that technology. Deciding what kind of art should be on show in any museum is bound to create some controversy. But at the Beaubourg, it was obvious from the start that many traditional ideas about the function of a museum were to be abandoned. The emphasis was on breaking down the dividing lines between art and everyday life. The role of women, for example, was the subject of one of the earliest exhibitions. Outside, Paris is still in many ways the 19th century capital created by Baron Haussmann in the days when Paris was undisputed capital of the art world. That's no longer the case. But another of Beaubourg's early exhibitions was devoted to Marcel Duchamp, an artist who in this century did as much as any single man could to further his nation's cultural reputation. Duchamp's nude descending a staircase created a sensation in America in 1913. He continued to create, to shock, and to influence fellow artists on both sides of the Atlantic, in a career that spanned almost every movement in 20th century art. But though he was acclaimed abroad, he was ignored in France for years. This was in fact the first major exhibition of Duchamp in France. Almost 200 works, many of them from the American collections that don't normally part with them. One of the main departments is the reference library. Accounting for more than half the daily visitors to the centre, it can accommodate 4,000 people a day, with enough room for 1,300 readers at any one time. With those figures, it's hardly surprising that in the first year alone, 3,000 volumes were thumbed to pieces. Statistically, it's impressive, but the fact is Paris doesn't have public lending libraries. More than 60% of users here are school children and teachers, who would just as happily go elsewhere for the same facility. There's a library specially for children to amuse themselves while their parents tour the rest of the museum. But for the more outgoing youngsters, there's a playground aimed specifically at providing amusements directly related to art. The children's section is more than a glorified babysitting service. There are 20 instructors who've all trained for 2 years in methods of awakening creativity in children. The kids may still be too young to appreciate Matisse or Mondrian, but here they can experiment with colour and at least make a start. The architects planned the centre as a living urban machine, which everyone, from the experts to the very young, would want to visit. The children's playground has already proved that at least half of that dream has come true. Perhaps the main criticism which has been levelled against Beaubourg is that it should be more of an artist's workshop, a place where works of art are actually created. To date, the museum's been filled with exhibits all brought in from outside. The children's playground is the only section which, to some extent, fulfills that concept of the centre. This was a popular offering at the Beaubourg some months later, an art show about an art show. It was typical of the centre's preoccupation with exactly what art is and how it fits into our lives.
Might be called an overlap of codes. The primary code is...
If it sounds boring and difficult, don't worry. It's supposed to be. The idea was to use life-size dummies to recreate what's known in art circles as a vernissage, or private viewing. Spaced out across the room, they give a disturbing appearance of reality, until you start to notice the faces. It's the work of Edward Kienholz, an American artist who's spent several years living in Europe. The original idea came to him way back in 1963, but it wasn't until 10 years later, in 1973, that he started trying to turn it into reality by casting the figures from live models. They were friends, family, or just people off the street. They were all quickly caught up in the project, sometimes quite literally.
Vi jobbade därför fram ett analysschema som dels tog upp några huvuddrag.
Behind it all, Kienholz is getting at the almost ridiculous notion of trying to put the meaning of a work of art into words. He's saying that it can't really be done, and that what comes out of the mouths of most art critics is, in his own words, twaddle, which doesn't have much meaning, and no one understands or gives a damn about anyway.
Dessutom blev alla bilderna antingen goda, manipulerade eller goda, något marginella, motsägelsefulla, kontroversiella eller väckande bilder existerade som illustrerar någon tanke vi har eller en formsammanställning som får oss att konstruera en.
The voices come from small cassette units in the chest, with an endless tape that just keeps on and on and on. To make things more realistic, there's a small silent fan hidden inside each head, which wafts a stream of air out of the mouth when the voice box is operating.
Conceptual artists have not only norms of object making, but also the norms of conceptual art itself. Conceptual art conceived.
The models were built in various studios, but they share one common feature. The mouthpieces are air conditioning vents from American automobiles, all taken from the same junk heap in Los Angeles one hot afternoon in May 1973. It might have been something they could have talked about with each other, but in Kienholz's Dialogue of the Deaf, nobody seems to be listening.
Pour laisser piller et dévaster du savoir
From Beaubourg, the view stretches far across Paris. But in the figurative sense, it goes much further, right across the Atlantic, in fact. For it was American art, above all, that toppled Paris from its cultural pedestal. Small wonder, then, that one of the museum's biggest and most prestigious shows to date was devoted to the artistic exchanges between the two nations. This is a reconstruction of the Montmartre Salon belonging to Gertrude Stein, the American writer and art collector who left California at the beginning of this century to install herself in Paris. Here she became the guiding spirit behind a group of writers and artists whose influence dominated the intellectual scene of the time. In the early days, the lamp was held up by the tallest member of the group to illuminate walls, which were at that time so crammed with paintings it was scarcely possible to see the color of the walls. At the beginning of the century, there were many Americans who wanted culture, had the money to pay for culture, and knew they had to come to Europe to get it. On their behalf, Gertrude Stein, along with fellow American Peggy Guggenheim, virtually discovered modern art in Paris. It came to New York in 1913 in a fabulous exhibition called the Armory Show, held in a former arsenal on 69th Street. Masterpieces by Matisse, Gauguin, Van Gogh and Cézanne joined 1,600 other works in an unprecedented and unsurpassed display of the best modern art that was available to be seen. This is Van Gogh's Dance at Arles. What gave the show added impact was that almost everything was up for sale. One of the most controversial sales was this, Cézanne's Colline des Pauvres, Pauper's Hill. It was purchased by New York's Metropolitan Museum. In fact, it was at the Armory Show that many of the major American collections were started. The Female Drunk by Georges Rouault, painted in 1905, was one of those works that stayed in France. But American interest in French art continued to be intense, both from the artists themselves and from the art-buying public. Pablo Picasso, though not in fact a Frenchman, painted many of the canvases that caused the biggest stir in Paris. This one, the studio, is now in New York. Artists such as Picasso and Matisse continued to command attention and wield an influence, whatever they did during the many phases through which 20th century art has passed. But gradually the flow of influence from Europe to America slowed down as American artists struggled to establish their own identity. It started early. This piece by Max Weber is from 1915. Weber, along with fellow American John Storrs, took the ideas of French Cubism and turned them into something different, more dynamic. American Carl Andre was influenced by the Romanian Brancusi, but his cedar piece was the product of no direct influence from outside. As early as the 1920s, American artists such as Man Ray had joined the French Dadaists, with an assurance that made them co-originators rather than mere followers. The real change came in the post-war years, with the development of American op art and pop art. Andy Warhol burst onto the scene in 1962 with his 20 Marilyns. It was the popular image of a revolution that had in fact already happened. American art was American, and it was the turn of the Europeans to cross the Atlantic to rub shoulders with the new men of the avant-garde. This is Daniel Spurry's collage called Pathways of Change. Like the Dadaists of the 1920s, works like this use everyday objects in bizarre ways, but with the added dimension of a social, even political comment. The banner was New Realism, and the movement was carried on in America by expatriate Europeans like Amor. This is his In Another Galaxy, again from 1964. Another expatriate, Paul Beery, moved into kinetic art for this 1967 work. Its title is a simple description: 182 balls on two opposed planes. Niki de Saint-Phal was one of the founders of the new realist movement. This is Crucifixion from 1963. Again, a collage largely made up of everyday objects, but with a very modern involvement in current issues, in this case, the role of women. As the American influences got back to Europe, artists like Bernard Rancière tried to give them a European expression. Like earlier Americans, such as Roy Lichtenstein, he used comic book illustrations as a basis for several works. But where Lichtenstein had concentrated on the graphic design methods used in the originals, Rancière and similar artists, such as Peter Saul, looked more to the actual content of the drawings, forging links between the fictional characters and real life. The story of cultural relations between France and America is in fact the history of art in this century. As this exhibition made clear, the European vision, founded on humanism, has been overtaken by American energy and irony. What's on show at Beaubourg isn't confined to the galleries. Equally important is the large piazza, which features just about anything that people will stop and look at, from traveling exhibitions to circus acts. It's a travelling museum of mechanical music, which simply uses the piazza as an occasional showplace. It may not seem to have much to do with modern culture, but as far as the organisers are concerned, it's all part of the Beaubourg experience. Is only small, but the range and variety are enormous. Here, for example, is a very early gramophone.
The stars and stripes forevermore. American record.
turn of the 19th century, these dancing dolls cheered up station waiting rooms in Switzerland. From the beginning of the 20th century, a clockwork skating scene, and still very much in working order. There are far more things to see and do at the Beaubourg than we've had time for here. 2 years on, the project is still under attack, still costing French taxpayers a lot of money, despite the enormous crowds. The organizers' reply is that good art is never cheap, and controversy is simply a sign of life and involvement. In their view, and in the opinion of many of its patrons, Beaubourg has already justified its existence. It works.